Welcome to the Psychedelic Passage podcast. My name is Jimmy Nguyen. I'm joined here by my co-host, Nick Levich. And with the new year starting off, we decided we wanted to go back to basics a little bit and have a few episodes over preparation and ceremony and just some useful components for folks who are engaging in any type of intentional psychedelic work. And so today, we're going to be talking about the body, physical components of the body, and then how that plays into preparation and ceremony. And I think a good place to start this conversation is, as you heard me allude to on the last episode, that this process is beyond the mind, meaning that you can't think your way through, nor is the mind the only tool that you have for preparing for a psychedelic experience and preparing for exploring your own consciousness in any type of way. I talk a lot to my clients about the connection between the mind, the body, the emotions that are arising. And so that will be a big crux of our conversation today. And as always, we hope to add some tangibility, some actionable information here as well that we hope all listeners find helpful. So where do you want to start with this, Nick, as far as talking about the importance, how the body plays into psychedelic experiences?
Well, I think before we even get into that, it's important to acknowledge that how most people that we see approach this work is cognitively. And the irony is that it's called mental health. So you'd think like, okay, it's all due to the mind, to my brain, but there's actually way more going on than that, because we got this body that's inextricably linked to our mind. And so some of you may be familiar with this concept if you read The Body Keeps the Score, or any of those books that start to highlight this connection between mind and body. But I think the most common challenge that we see around this is that folks come into this work thinking that they're going to think their way through it, or intellectualize their way through it, or conceptualize their way through it, and it just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, I find the most common ways that this shows up are people who are saying, I've read the research, I've looked at the clinical studies, I'm looking for that neuroplasticity, I'm looking to lower my default mode network, I'm looking for ego dissolution, I'm looking to build new synapses in the brain. And although all of those things are very promisingly showing up in psychedelic research, if you only focus on that, you're negating a really big part of the process, which is your body. And we've had episodes about somatic experiencing and
Trauma.
trauma and a lot of different content around the body. And what, to your point, very simply, there's just some telling science nowadays, knowing that the vast majority of serotonin that our brain uses is actually built in the gut, knowing that there's a relationship between what they call like the gut brain axis, or like the microbiome of the gut. There's now some research out there that's linking certain mental health diagnoses as actually being related just as much to our bodies and our stomachs as it is to any type of neurochemical deficiency or imbalance as well. And so I
And the
think,
same goes with something as external as back pain.
sure,
Like, how
yeah.
many of you have experienced neck or back pain that increases with stress?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? We think about stress as this more mental thing, but it also has a bodily component here. And so I think what I want to stress on this episode is that there is a very physical component to the healing process, especially in altered states work with plant medicines.
Yeah, so we'll talk a little bit later in this episode about what may come up during ceremony, in prep, even in integration. But I want to pause a little bit on what you were just talking there about, almost like the location of emotions or things that arise. And so we started off by prefacing this conversation about connecting the mind to the body, but I also think that there is a conversation to be had around what I call like the emotion body. Stress being an emotion that we feel in addition to cortisol and spike neurotransmitters, things like that, and then how it shows up in the body. And so can you talk to people a little bit about this concept of the emotion body and how that's stored?
The way that I think about it is that there is a direct relationship between thoughts and emotions. So if you think the thought, I'm grateful for my health today, it can just exist as a thought, or with enough true visualization, we can actually start to feed ourselves the emotion of gratitude. And the emotion of gratitude is exactly what you talk about. It's a certain mix of chemical cocktail of, serotonin and norepinephrine and dopamine and whatever else, and it's got all the right ratios. But the point is that we're highlighting this connection between the brain and the body, and then these emotions are quite literally energy in motion moving through our body. And so we may experience things like anxiety in our gut or tension in our chest. And what you can start to pick out is the qualities of these emotions. Is it persistent? Is it acute? Is it a thumping? Does it have a color, a texture, a feel? And we can really start to look into how we're experiencing these emotions in our body.
So this is part physical body. And then also what comes up for me is the nervous system. As you were talking, I was thinking about just times where, the hair stands up on my arm, or times where my spidey sense is tingling and I'm like, okay, something's not right here in this situation. And then I'm now, as you're talking, I'm thinking about, okay, there's a chemical process there. Maybe my adrenaline starts to pop up a little bit. My body gets a little bit more alert. But then also there's a little fear, a little nervousness, a little anxiety. And in a real life-threatening situation, all of those things are useful. All of those things are really, really helpful.
Yep.
And so I'm just using that almost as an analogy or a metaphor for what you're describing, that there's a lot more going on besides the thought and the synapse that's creating that
Right.
thought.
And so the important piece as it relates to the work that we do is, if you ignore all of that because you're so busy reading about the default network or trying to conceptualize how your journey is going to go, you're missing out on this whole bodily component.
Hmm.
And so it is part of, yours, mine, all of our responsibility, if we're choosing to journey, to honor this process as being just as much physical as it is cognitive, because we
Yeah,
live in
yeah.
a
Mhm.
society that um, places an incredible amount of importance and value on intelligence, on thinking, on smarts, when in reality, it's possible to be smart to a fault where you're totally disconnected to your body, and only through this very intentional process do you start to discover what's actually going on beneath your neck.
Well, I'm grateful that our society here in America is now starting to value like EQ, emotional intelligence, empathy. For sure, the like Gen Z population are a little bit more attuned to that than boomers and predecessors even before that. And one thing that I find with this concept of like how emotions show up in our bodies and in our nervous system is that I find that there's a locational component to this as well. Knowing that nature loves patterns and it loves efficiency and it loves to conserve energy. What I find is that when there are certain emotions or things that people are feeling, usually that just shows up in our body in like pretty standard ways. Like like feeling back pain when you're stressed. That's a great example. Or having the anxiety on your chest. Like a lot of people feel like there's this like crushing, feeling on their chest when they sometimes feel anxiety and things like that. And so what I share with folks, in addition to acknowledging their emotion, feeling it, is also trying to identify, okay, like how is this showing up in my body? Where is it showing up? What does it feel like? Is it dull? Is it tingly? Is it uncomfortable? Is it hot? Is it, whatnot? Does it actually show up as some type of physical ailment, whether it's a muscle problem or a skin problem or a foot problem or whatnot? How does it affect your energy levels, your fatigue, your mental acuity? All of these things are connected, into the body as well. So the more that you can get some eyes on that, like your awareness, that you can map that, the more helpful that you can start to build some patterns and trends, so that if something comes up in the future and you're like, I can't identify what this is, but I know it's kind of giving me that same feeling in my stomach as when I'm feeling unsafe, as an example. And so
Yep.
that data almost is really useful when folks are in preparation, in ceremony, in integration.
To sum it up, if you don't already have a relationship with your body, it's time to start cultivating one.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what something that you were saying before we started recording the episode is that the same way that we share with folks in prep that the pot gets stirred, we mean that spiritually, mentally, emotionally, and bodily. And so the body just starts doing weird stuff, I find, when folks
Totally.
are in prep and leading into any type of exploration of the self or consciousness.
So let's talk about what that looks like for people, like actual examples of what we see. And this can happen in prep, it can happen during the ceremony itself, it can happen in integration. But what are some of these themes that show up as, physical experiences, physical sensations?
The number one thing that comes up for me is when people start to feel aches and pains that they weren't aware of before. And so they'll go through, whether you pop an Advil or a Tylenol every day, hopefully not, or whether you're just in a place where you're somewhat disconnected to your body. I have a lot of folks just identifying like, oh, like there is something going on with my foot. There is something going on with my back. There is like this tension that I feel. Oh, my muscles are tight here, or I'm feeling something in my neck. And so that is pretty unrelated to a lot of the traditional conversation that we have around prep and intentional psychedelic use. But I find that is pretty accurate signal when you start to just notice like aches, pains, things that aren't working right, within your body.
Yep, we've talked about this in the past, but stomach aches can show up a lot, and a lot of
Mm-hmm.
times, they're actually like emotional stomach aches is what I call them. It's really easy to think you ate something that you shouldn't have eaten, when in reality, it's your anxiety manifesting in your gut. Other things that I see a lot, especially in prep, is fatigue.
Yeah.
Just like this extreme fatigue, because we don't tend to slow down unless we get laid down.
Yeah.
And so, when we've got work and kids and family and obligations and dinner events and whatever, it can be hard to slow down. And what's asked of us in prep is to slow down. And so if we don't take the initiative to do it ourselves, I see a lot of times the body kind of takes over and just lays us down and basically forces us to go horizontal.
Yeah. Then that's when people get, sick with illnesses and flu and, whatnot, and fatigue, tiredness, uh, difficulty focusing, mental clarity is
Yep.
also related to the body, headaches, stomach aches, like you said. And then something that you touched on that I find with some folks is that like appetite and food preferences sometimes change with folks going into preparation as well, especially for those who are putting some mindfulness and awareness just around their own self inventory, where they just start to notice how certain foods make them feel, or noticing, oh, like when I have this emotion, I go to that, or I hit the candy, cabinet or whatnot. But I find that for a lot of folks, for sure after ceremony, having quite a change to their preferences. I had a client who would traditionally only drink flavored water, Propel. And then when they came out, they had a real taste for like non-sugared herbal tea. We've
Mm.
seen folks who are vegetarians who come out and eat red meat. Like there's a lot of dietary things that can pop up for folks through the body as well in preparation for ceremony.
Which is almost never talked about. Like
Mm-hmm.
no research papers, no studies are like very few, if any, are actually talking about this physical bodily component. And that's why I felt very called to make an episode on this, because it's very rarely addressed, but it's an essential part of this process all the way from prep through integration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for me, when I find or come across real audaciously difficult content in psychedelic experiences or leading up to it, I notice my body wanting to like binge eat or eat that like deep heavy fried stuff, or just like eat that like bad stuff, because I know now that's a way of my body trying to check out. That's a way of me trying to like distract from the work at hand as well. And so it's pretty interesting, this connection, that we're talking about here.
Well, and so a lot of what we've talked about is the stuff that will come up in prep, but then there's also a whole host of physical sensations that will arise during the actual ceremony itself. For those of you that listened to our episode on trauma, you may have heard some of these before. Everything from shaking, convulsing, spitting, grunting,
Vocalizations,
yelling,
tremors. There's parts of your body that get really tense. There's parts of your body that start to loosen up a little bit. I think that,
sweating,
yeah.
temperature
Mm-hmm.
fluctuations. I mean, basically, what I tell people is if you're experiencing something weird during the journey, that's normal.
Right. I think there's a huge piece on validating the normalcy of somebody's experience. That doesn't mean that it's not meaningful and unique to whatever that journeyer is going through. But I find a lot of folks just find comfort in being like, oh, I'm not the only one who's oscillating from like extreme cold to extreme heat. Oh, I'm not the only one that feels like, XYZ. And that allows folks to have permission to be in their body. It allows folks to give themselves permission to move through the psychedelic experience in whatever way makes sense for them in the moment and at the time. I think the biggest piece of this bodily discomfort conversation that we're having, especially with psilocybin, is nausea and vomiting. And there's layers to this. A lot of folks point to the conversion of psilocybin into psilocin and then other active psychedelic compounds that are creating this nausea. I also find a lot of folks who have some barriers or resistance to certain content and things that can sometimes show up as nausea. There are also certain people who just have sensitive GI systems, and that it can just purely be like a physiological thing. I acknowledge that too, but like 90% of the time when somebody is experiencing nausea, there's something emotional or energetic about that as well, which we can't necessarily quantify in science, but
Yep.
we've seen that to be true. Especially in ayahuasca experiences where like purging is an accepted just part of that process, just as an example.
Yeah, to the point where they call it purging and not vomiting because it is a energetic and physical purge.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what's interesting is almost all of the physical sensations that we talked about are like not that pleasurable.
Right.
And so this to me is a byproduct of living in a society where, first of all, very few of us actually live in our bodies. And then on top of that, we treat our bodies like amusement parks, and we go, chock them full of caffeine in the morning, suck down our e-cig, maybe take a, something to focus. Then we move into the evening and we have a couple drinks to wind down. And what we're basically talking about here is like a form of societally accepted numbing out. And so when we finally actually do get in touch with our bodies, lo and behold, there's like some pretty uncomfortable sensations in there.
Nick, I feel attacked with what you just said there. I'm just kidding. I've moved from taking my body from an amusement park to a recreational vehicle, and it's a lot more directed, in that sense. But I think you're right. Like it's not just about the body in itself, but also what we put in our bodies, the way that we manage feelings and emotions through food, drink, substances, activities, dopamine hits, all of that plays into it. And the more that you can tune into where your baseline of your body is at, the better you can look at, okay, what's this process mean? What does this mean for me? And so that's why we always recommend for folks at least 5 to 7 days before a ceremony. But if you can go for longer, to try to limit your caffeine consumption, to try to be mindful of your diet and what you put into your body, to try to be mindful of unnecessary, medications, whether you take 2 Aleve a day for migraines, or whether you're taking, a couple Advil a day because of this consistent back pain. And so the more that you can remove some of those variables, the more that you can feel into like, okay, this is where my body is at. Interesting. Okay, so there's some stuff going on here that I probably need to look at.
Yeah, and once again, it's probably not going to be that comfortable. Yeah. But I want to emphasize that we don't do this process for comfort or for fun or for pleasure or for joy. It's literally because it's rewarding and we want to heal. We want something to shift in our life. And unless we're prepared to sit in some temporary discomfort for this much longer term gain, it just usually doesn't go that well.
Yeah, here's the X factor too, is that you can feel a wide range of emotions all at once. And so I've had a couple of my past clients feeling discomfort and sorrow and despair and hopelessness, and then also feeling joy and support and connectivity and love. And so if you're feeling all of those things all at once, and that's all stirring around in your body, that can be a lot. That can be quite overwhelming. And so a part of this is what I call nervous system regulation. And there's ways that you can do that in preparation. There's certainly a lot of tools and skills that you can use in ceremony, but your nervous system plays a part in the loading of all of those emotions and feelings. And so if you are a person who walks through life and only feels 5 main feelings, and then you move into a psychedelic experience, and then, by the way, they all live in the body somewhere, somehow, and then you move into a psychedelic experience and there's a wide range, maybe there's 15, 20, I don't know, 100, 200, there's like thousands of words for different types of emotions, that can overload you quite a bit. And so I think that there's a tangible, again, strategic component around tuning into your body so that it can really be your ally in ceremony and in integration as well.
Yeah, I always call the body the bridge to the subconscious.
Mm-hmm.
The subconscious speaks to us through our body. And so, I have this experience all the time where like my brain's telling me that I need to be productive and I need to work and I got things to do today. And my body is tired, like really tired. And we have a choice to make. We've all probably experienced this, right? A conflict between the head and the heart is what I call it. Or you can think about it as, between the head and the body. But there's a conflict happening here. And the question is, do we take that opportunity to mentally override and force ourselves to do the things that we're telling ourselves we need to do? Or do we give ourselves permission to just like take a break for an hour and feel into this fatigue in our body, and maybe with some curiosity about what is underlying it. And I recognize that, yes, we have things to do and you can't do that every day. But if you're in an intentional preparation process for an upcoming ceremony, it is in your best interest to start to honor those bodily sensations, because that's what actually allows you to get the most out of your journey.
Yeah, and I think for some listeners who are hearing this part of what you're sharing, I acknowledge that not everybody feels like they have the time, not everybody feels like they have the bandwidth to. Maybe some folks are listening, being like, wow, that's a nice luxury to be able to take a break in the middle of the workday and whatnot. And I acknowledge that that is true to a degree, that there are some folks who do have to punch in, punch out. They do got kids. Maybe they're working two jobs. There are folks who are like, I truly don't have a lot of time here. My first question for those folks who are thinking about a psychedelic experience is, how much time do you have to prioritize your own healing and growth moving into a psychedelic ceremony anyways? And then the other side of it is going back to, I think, this internal choice that people are making, that is a precursor to all of this, meaning that if you are really serious about aligning all of these parts of yourself, your spirit, your mind, your body, your emotions, and you're serious about moving into an intentional psychedelic process in some way, shape, or form, it requires effort. It requires commitment. It requires making time. It requires carving out. And for some folks, that looks like 5-10 minutes a day. For some
Which is
folks,
still better than ignoring altogether.
100%. Yeah, 100%. For some folks, at least for me, my shower time is usually the time where I'm like checked out thinking about nothing. And then when I I'm moving towards a psychedelic ceremony or an experience, I'm using that time. I'm using my drive time, my commute time, my like whatever time to be like, okay, I'm gonna do a little 2-minute meditation. I'm gonna do a little bit of a check-in. I'm just gonna do a little scan of my body and my emotions just to like check in, really quickly. And so this looks different for each person, I think. But fundamentally, it's still all the same. You have to prioritize this. You have to make time for it. You have to honor this process of connecting your mind to your body, to your spirit, to your emotions.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate what you said, because it doesn't have to be dedicated time spent just to sitting with your body, but you can bring that bodily awareness into everything you do. And I think that that's where you can start to cultivate that connection in real time, as opposed to in like dedicated chunks of time. But it's definitely possible. Like, you're like, oh, I haven't checked in on my body for a while because I've been writing this paper. Pause, take a deep breath, and just see what's going on in your body. It's the awareness that starts everything in this process.
Yeah, and that can be a couple of seconds. I like this concept of like net time, or like no extra time. I find that it's when I'm doing my dishes. Anytime I'm doing my dishes, I'm just using that as an opportunity to just like check in and like see where I'm at. I hope that everybody has at least 5, 10, 15 minutes in the day, to themselves. And I think that choice ultimately is a big factor here. So what else do you want to talk about around this topic? What's important for listeners and folks to be aware of?
I think the main thing that I want to stress is just to not ignore what's going on in your body. You don't need to fully understand it. You don't need to dissect every single thing, but ignoring it doesn't help. And so use this as an opportunity to step into the observer that Jimmy talks about and go, oh, interesting. There's that shoulder tightness again. Oh, interesting. There's this weight on my chest. Oh, interesting. I'm feeling like I need to clear my throat a lot today. Those are all very important aspects to be aware of when you're moving through a process like this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially with a lot of female clients that I have, there's a lot of like stomach, womb area things that sometimes come up. especially with, women stepping into their power and agency and sovereignty. Throat chakra stuff tends to come up in our work together. And so there are some, patterns and things that arise. I think the other thing that I want to express to folks is that this is a completely normal and accepted part of this process, that stuff is going to come up with the body. It is going to be a little uncomfortable. Sometimes it's very uncomfortable. And so if it's any comfort for people to know, okay, this is somewhat integrated into the process. I'm not the only one that's this biological weirdo that's feeling all this stuff, coming up in our body. And just knowing that likely anybody who's gone through some type of a meaningful transformation with psychedelics has had some factor or component of this coming up for them.
Yep. And just so everybody knows, regardless if it's in prep, ceremony, or integration, literally any time, however you feel in your body is not permanent. It will always shift. And so I think that understanding allows us to sink deeper into however we're feeling, knowing that that's not going to extend its duration. In actuality, I find the opposite is true. When we sink deeply into the emotion that we're feeling, it often passes more quickly than wanting to feel some type of other way.
Oh, for sure. That's so tangible when folks are dealing with nausea in psilocybin experiences. The more that folks want it to go away and the more that they focus on it and then they bring all of their attention to it, that's what makes it stay. And then when folks are acknowledging of it, aware of it, breathing through it, that's oftentimes when it fades, or maybe it comes and goes, or maybe it's, maybe it's related to some somatic process that's going on. And so I think that's really, really great, tangible advice for folks. Well, that does it for our episode today. We hope that you found some value in listening to our dialogue and conversation. You can download episodes of the Psychedelic Passage podcast anywhere you find your own podcast, cannabisradio.com, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Spotify, iHeartRadio. We thank you for the community that we've really built around the podcast. We've been getting a lot of comments and notes around how our conversations have been helpful for folks. And so thank you for listening. If you like the show, please rate and review us. And we look forward to seeing you next week.
The opinions expressed on this CannabisRadio.com program are those of the guests and hosts and do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of CannabisRadio.com. Any rebroadcast, republication, or retransmission of this program without proper consent is prohibited.